Hey everybody, it's Justin from the Camera Shop of Muskegon, and I'm here with a very special guest, Mr. Jared Ivey, who is the lead tech rep from Sigma. Jared, thank you for joining us this evening/afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Camera Shop in Muskegon.
Well,
Excited to be here.
well, we're happy to have you, and we're very thankful that you could give us some of your time here this evening/afternoon. I've got to ask you, Jared. A lot of people, you're the lead tech rep there at Sigma. Um, how did you, can you give people, do you have a photo background? Give us a little bit of your background as how you got started in the photo industry. Or not the photo industry, but photography yourself.
Sure. Yeah. So my parents, when I was really young, they bought me some cameras. I had an old disc camera back in the day, an old 110 camera. To just photograph, whatever's in the backyard. But when I was about 12 years old, my parents enlisted me enrolled me, I should say, in a class through Parks and Recreation in Tucson, Arizona, and it was called Black and White Photography for Teens. And I was 12 years old, and that was the youngest you could be to get in that class. And they had their old Asahi Pentax camera, from the early 70s that they
Hmm.
had, been using, and let me borrow that and bought some black and white film and some paper and went to this class. And it was, the first time that I had processed my own film and, made my first print. I mean, it was magical. It was absolutely wonderful. It was cool because it wasn't like a structured class like you see in photo class now. It was basically, this is how you process, this is how you expose, this is how you process film, this is how you make a print. And, and other than that, it was just kind of wide open as far as what we wanted to take pictures of. So it was friends, the dog, and I started making little model sets with my with toys. And moving into high school, I took the photography class they had there, and I was really drawn to commercial photography. I really wanted to be, have a studio and lights and just fabulous and fun and exciting. Um, which led me to start assisting for local photographers in Southern Arizona. And I went on to make relationships with a production company that would supply assistance and help when photographers would come in from other parts of the world or other parts of the country to shoot catalogs. Back then, commercial photography was really big in the West, in the Southwest, because you can shoot pretty much year round.
Hmm.
The summer months are really too hot, but they were doing summer and spring catalog shoots. I'm sorry, summer and fall catalog shoots in the winter and spring, because a lot of other places in the country were packed in with snow. So there was a lot of work there, a lot of experience, and eventually I went on to go to school for photography. And it's funny, I again, my background is in studio photography, so did a lot of product and architecture outside of school. But as all photographers know, once somebody knows you have a camera, then they start asking, oh, well, my nephew's going to be getting married. Will you shoot a wedding? Oh, we need headshots. And the next thing you know, I'm shooting pretty much everything else that I wanted, I was shooting everything else that I really didn't want to shoot. But you know what? Yeah, you're a photographer and you got to make money. And that's what I did. So that led me to supplementing my income working at a camera store for part of my life. And I happened to have just to kind of be in the right place at the right time. I had a specific skill set that I knew a lot about technical aspects of photography and gear and optics, as well as a background in photography. And I happened to meet a gentleman by the name of Dave Metz, who worked for Canon for many years in the marketing department. Then he went to work for Sigma when Sigma started making products that were a lot more advanced than what they had previously, and they were looking to build a tech team, and so that was kind of his specialty. So after talking with him a little bit, I ended up getting a job with Sigma, and here we are 8 years later.
Really neat. There's a lot to unpack there with all that. So like you started shooting at a very young age as a teenager, right at about 12 years old.
Yes.
And they already had you in the dark room while you were doing this camp. And how long was this camp? Was it like a week long? Was it like was it just a day camp? What was the time span? I'm just kind of curious with that stuff.
It was like 6 or 8 weeks. It was 6 or 8 weeks, but it was once a week. It was
So
Monday evening, and you would you'd learn a little bit in the class. and then that week go shoot, come back with your film the next week and process it, dry it, the next week come back and make prints. That was kind of how the first 3 weeks went. Then after that, it was just kind of up to you if you wanted to go in and process film or make prints. At that point, it was just using the facilities and having somebody to kind of answer questions. But it was cool because they didn't really have a set curriculum. It wasn't really about photography topics. It was more, the mechanics of exposure, processing film, printing.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think back to my time in college, and the one thing I never will forget is being I went to the college I went to because they still had a film program. Most other schools in the Midwest were still doing digital. We're just primarily doing digital. So the one thing I don't know do you still appreciate or remember the smell of a dark room? I mean, that's something that I just have an affinity for. Like, yeah, it's not like one of the best smells, but it's just something where, I don't know, that's where the magic happens. So it's one of those, it kind of triggers your senses. And I just think that's really cool that you got to do that at such a young age. And then you started, when were you in college or high school when you started photo assisting? At what time did that happen?
So the high school I went to, my senior year of high school, they had a really cool program called, I don't remember what it was called, professional internship program. And what they did is they had a select group of students that they would create internships for what you wanted to do, as a career and try things out. So, I wanted to be a commercial photographer. So a local commercial photographer they hooked me up with, and I went and worked for free and learned a lot. And that's kind of how I got my foot in the door to assisting. And, from there, I looked up production companies, like I said, that would provide, they'll provide anything as far as, if they need trailers or makeup artists or assistants when photographers are coming in from other places. So they don't have to bring their entire crew. They could just hire local. And because I had that background in assisting, I was able to start getting, paid really good day rates, right out of high school, like 18, 19 years old.
Yeah, that's really cool. And for most people who don't know, Jared, because I did some assisting after college, there's kind of two questions to this, and I know we're sticking more on the personal side first, but it's just kind of nice to give people kind of that insight on how you got started with photography. What does an assistant typically do? Because we know the photographer is producing the work and kind of setting up the shots and stuff, but what does the assistant get to do? And if people who are watching who are young enough or interested enough in becoming a photo assistant, what kind of job or expectations can they expect?
So depending on the photo shoot, there's different levels of assistance. On really big shoots, I was the third assistant, so I was the assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the photographer. And then this is, we're talking mid '90s, so
yeah.
Film, the first assistant, which typically the photographer would bring his first assistant from, wherever he was with him, because he knew exactly, the first assistant's the one that sits there and sets up the camera, the lenses, and he knows. Typically, first assistants are photographers themselves, and the photographer trusts them because they know what a lens is going to do for them for that particular shot. So a lot of times the first assistant will be, trying to anticipate what the photographer is going to want as far as gear for that particular shot, or if he's going to need lights or reflectors, and he'll start getting that stuff together, or at least organizing it, directing it. And the second assistants, they're the ones that they are basically do what the first assistant tells them. Third assistant, I'm huffing sandbags and running back and forth and getting, stuff out of the grip truck, loading film backs in the morning because it was, 120 film. So I was, sitting there just loading film, as many backs as they had. And then, throughout the day, and they would teach me the process of, you take the spent roll out, you put it in, mark it with this, put it in here. And you do that stuff, but, after you get that, you start watching the second assistant and first assistant, you kind of move up a little bit. Some of the other shoots that weren't as complex, I would be the first assistant. And but again, you do have to know what lenses are going to do what. You have to know your way around the camera, around a tripod, around lights. So when the photographer tells you that he needs, the light over there with that specific modifier and a certain power, you have to know how to accomplish all of that so that they don't have to sit there and teach you.
Yeah, they're spending more of their time shooting, and you're their arms and legs and everything else. It's kind of like they're just the ones tripping the shutter and directing their models. Now, I again, this is kind of the last personal thing I'll ask. Being an assistant, I know that assistants always have a story. I don't know, is there one good story or something crazy that you have that you're willing to share? It's something, it's kind of like war stories.
Yeah.
Do you have anything like that you're willing to share of like one of the crazy things that happened as an assistant?
Yes, actually, and that was because I bit off more than I can chew. I had worked as a first and second assistant a number of times, and then a photographer was coming in from Germany, and he was coming by himself. He wasn't bringing an assistant. They asked if I, knew how to do this, knew how to do that, and I did know everything that he needed to know, but I was a little nervous, and I was working too fast, and he was a Nikon shooter, so he was using the Nikon. I'm trying to think, it was the F100 camera body maybe at the time. I'm trying to think what it was. But I'm like fumbling around trying to just move really too fast, and I ended up sticking a thumb through one of the shutter curtains, and trying to load film and just moving way too fast.
Oh.
So one camera down. Later on, I dropped another camera. I put a second camera down. He had 3 cameras with him, and his main camera and 2 backups, and I destroyed 2 out of 3.
Oh man!
So I spent that night trying to source, camera loaner or camera rentals to replace the other 2.
Wow, that is a story. So were you sweating bullets? I mean, did he come down on you pretty hard, or?
Yes, there were a few other. One of the mornings I overslept, and I was late to the call time, and it was quite embarrassing. And at the very end, he did a little rap session, and toasted me to the most unbelievable assistant he ever had, and everyone laughing and clapping, and I thought it was a very nice compliment. And then it dawned on me later that night that he didn't mean it really necessarily in a nice way.
Yeah. Wow. Well, hey, I appreciate you sharing that. It's one of those things where, again, having been an assistant, I know everyone has a story. I've heard things of like people, like we loaded up an old house that had like 1940s wiring with a bunch of strobes, and like we took one shot and we started smelling something hot, so we went to go check the breaker, and the breaker was on fire.
Oh,
of this old house. And that's not my story. That's something that I've heard from other assistants, and everyone's got one. I mean, I've had a crazy one where we were moving a sweep that was on a big metal pipe that was like that, that wide, and heavy paper on sky stands about 6. I'm 5'8". They were already above me, twice above me, so this thing fell and almost took me off my feet. I got 5 staples in my head, and it almost knocked me out. I was bleeding everywhere. It was just crazy. So I mean, I got my story out of it, but I worked in a food studio in Minneapolis, and that was a lot of fun being able to see that and learning about that. So I thank you for sharing trading war stories here on that. So you worked at a camera store, and you got into the business with Sigma, and you've been there. They're a senior tech rep for them for how long?
Oh gosh, senior tech rep maybe 4 years, 5 years.
And you've been with them for how long? Beyond the 4 years as a senior tech rep, how long have you been there?
About 8.5 years.
8.5 years? Okay. So about as long as I've been at the camera shop here. So in that time, you've learned a lot. Were you there for the initial launch of the Global Initiative program, or were you there prior to that?
No, I had started the year before they announced that they were going to re-engineer everything and go to the Global Vision line of lenses. You're working in a camera store, which I'm sure all of your viewers here have visited your shop. Camera stores are an incredible resource that I'm really surprised more people don't take advantage of.
Mm-hmm.
And working there, I worked there so I could gain knowledge of, and you gain knowledge of a lot of equipment, from lighting to mics to something you didn't even think, but it's amazing when that stuff comes into, when you need to know it, it's nice starting to know that. Plus the knowledge of all the other people that work there, so whatever you don't learn on your own, you have a wealth of information. And going into camera stores now, I mean, that's, you see people that walk in that really don't know much about, either if it's lighting or audio or something, background. And there's always, every employee in a camera store knows kind of about everything, but you'll always find specialists of different varieties. So there's just so much information at a camera shop. So working at a camera store, I gained a lot of information. Eventually I did work in sales for a little bit, but I started managing the rental and repair department. Mm-hmm. And that's where I got to learn a lot more about optics. I completely went off track.
It's okay.
Yeah. So, working at a camera store, yes. I was aware of third-party lenses. I was a Canon shooter for 35 millimeter at the time. And I'm not saying that Canon was better than Nikon. It just a long time ago, one of the photographers that I worked with a lot used Canon, and I started using Canon. And when I went to buy a camera, because I already knew it, I bought the camera, then I bought the lenses, and then digital came out. So that was just, I never chose Canon over any other brand. It was just, that's the way it was. But back then, when I went to school for photography, you had to buy a 4x5, you had to have a medium format camera, and you had to have a 35 millimeter camera, and it had to be a professional brand. And the lenses, and it even had a list of lenses you could buy. The only third-party lenses you could buy were Zeiss. There was no Tamron, no Sigma. Because at the time, those third-party manufacturers, amongst a few others, they were budget cameras or budget lenses. And Sigma did have some good products here and there, but for the most part, honestly, it was a budget friendly manufacturer. And I'm not saying that the products were inferior. Like I said, they did have some great legacy glass. Mm-hmm. For the most part, a lot of professional photographers would not buy a third-party lens. And when I was at the camera store about 2009, 2010, you started to see more and more lenses coming from Sigma that were a big jump in quality than what they'd had before. They started winning awards, and it was rivaling and sometimes outperforming a few of the lenses from other manufacturers. Now, in defense of the other manufacturers, their lenses were 10, 13, 15 years old, and Sigmas were brand new. Which had a big difference once digitally clipped film, it started showing more and more imperfections in lenses. That's Sigma started to expand, and they were looking for representatives to go out into the field and work at camera stores and teach workshops and classes, to be able to spread the word about it. And then a year later, they came out with the Global Vision line, the art, contemporary, and sports. And that's when things really, really took off for Sigma.
And that's kind of where, that lead up is. I wanted to, because prior to the Global Series program, it was kind of like the EX series was their big lead on. So what, I'll kind of put these two questions together is, with them moving from the EX series to the Global Series, what makes the Global Series initiative lenses so much better? And the second kind of tie-in question is, why should someone consider Sigma lenses for a purchase over another competitor, or maybe even a native lens like Canon L series, or some of the higher Nikon glass or Sony glass like the Sony G Master series? What can you say about that?
So the biggest difference is really the company and the type of company that it is. The one thing that makes Sigma really, really unique is the fact that it's family-owned company. It's privately held, and therefore it's a smaller company. Now it is quite large, and they do have a large factory, and they have subsidiaries, different countries around the world. But compared to the other lens manufacturers, it is a little bit smaller of a company. Their philosophy is big factory, small office, and What that means is they put about 20% of their budget into sales, marketing, and administration, and the other 80% into production.
Yeah.
Their goal is to make the highest quality lenses possible. And one of the ways they can do it is the fact that they manufacture everything themselves in one factory in Japan. Um, they can keep a very tight quality control because they're not outsourcing a lot of things. I mean, they machine some of their own screws. They punch out their own aperture blades and make their own irises. They make their own housings. They make their own lens caps. I mean, everything is done in one place. And having production and engineering all in one location means they can pass information up and down the line very quickly. So if something's not working, they can quickly change it.
So it's like stop the presses, stop the presses. We need to we need to write a new article.
Right.
Nice. Yeah.
And the other thing to stand behind their quality and just add an extra level of quality control that you don't see from the other lens manufacturers is, well, I should say the other autofocus lens manufacturers, is they test every single lens before it leaves the factory. They created their own, they call it the A1 testing machine. And this is utilizing the Foveon sensor, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with the DP or the SD cameras. It's a 46, effectively 46 megapixel sensor. And this machine, they put every lens on the machine, and not only does it test the center sharpness, but it goes to the edges and corners and tests the sharpness, all from across the entire plane. And if it doesn't pass, it doesn't get shipped out. So you see very little out-of-box defects with the Sigma lenses, and that's people are just amazed at the level of sharpness, the neutral colors, the amount of correction for vignetting and chromatic aberration that you would see with other lenses.
Yeah, and I'm a proud owner of many of the art lineups since that came in. I owned one of the first 50-1.4 EX series lenses, but the minute the 50 art came out, that was hands down. It was boom. That was the first lens I purchased, and then I got the 35 and 24 after that. I want to scoop up the 70-200. I got the 70-200 EX, and that's still a great lens. But that even though that art lens is a little beefier with the new 70-200, the bokeh spins in the background, and that's something that if you start to get a spinny bokeh, that is hard to come by, and I just like that because it kind of helps naturally vignette with the bokeh in your image. So with that being said, they've got the quality control. Is that really why someone should buy their product over someone else? Like why they should choose, why not choose a 50 art over like the Nikon 50-1.4?
So usually when somebody buys a Sigma lens over another manufacturer, it's usually for one of three reasons. It's either because the lens is competitive as far as, or I should say comparable as far as quality, but at a much lower price. Second reason is a lot of times the lens may be outperforming the other manufacturer's lens, and again, at a lower price, or at least very even
equal
price.
to. Yep.
Yeah. And then the third is because Sigma has a number of lenses that other manufacturers just don't make, and that's where the innovative part of the company comes in. Is they were the first manufacturer to come out with 1.8 zoom lenses, the 18-35 and the 50-100. The useful tools like USB dock, where you can customize the lenses depending on the lens that you have. You can do a number of different things like speed up or slow down autofocus, make custom focus limitations, change how we get the throw on the manual focus. Do micro autofocus adjustments at 16 different places throughout the lens. And again, you can't customize, that's not the same, you can't customize every lens the same, but depending on the lens, those are the different options you have. So yeah, typically when somebody buys a Sigma lens, it's because of one of those three reasons.
Yeah, and I would agree with a lot of those. The biggest thing is I'm amazed at what you get for the price. 70-200, you'll spend another $1,000 on any of the competitors' lenses, and the quality's there. And they did something special with the 70-200 2.8 Sport recently, right? It has the most like FLD elements or something like that in it.
Yeah, they're low dispersion glass.
So that helps with the extra sharpness or quality of the photo.
Yes, it helps with light transmission. There's a number of things, but it really has to do with correction for chromatic aberration, sharpness, minimal ghosting and flaring. I mean, if you just shoot with one of those lenses that has that glass in it, towards the sun, the flaring is just, it's really controlled. You still see pretty good contrast. I mean, it's, when you shoot into the sun, you're definitely washing out your image a little bit. You're losing saturation and contrast, but if you look at that compared to other manufacturers, I mean, it's gorgeous.
Yeah, and I've been happy with all of them that I've ever used. And my buddy Kenny, who's our store ambassador, he will say he says I will shoot with nothing but Sigma. Sigma's not giving me a reason to shoot with anything else other than their lenses, and he just keeps on growing that collection on his D850, and that's where those lenses are really shining. I mean, the global series initiative. I mean, they're really kind of designing those for high megapixel sensors, are they not?
Yes. I mean, last year or so, I've heard the term, used a lot in regards to Sigma lenses, the term future-proof. Meaning that, like I was saying before, with so let's say the year 2000, or sorry, the year 2010, when DSLRs started really taking off and having higher megapixels, you started to see the lenses that people had been using, legacy glass had been using for a decade or two. They've always been super, super sharp with film and with lower megapixel cameras. They were cutting it more, and so the newer design lenses, which Sigma was making at the time, were outperforming a lot of the same lenses from other manufacturers for that reason. So yeah, what they're doing is trying to build a lens that's going to last and not just show you all the megapixels that you have now, but potentially, resolution down the road, because we know that this technology is just moving at lightning speed. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. And we see that still, like the 35 millimeter 1.4 ART, which was the first lens to come out in the Global Vision series, and the 50 millimeter 1.4. Those are still two of the best sellers that we have, and those, the 35 millimeter is almost 8 years old. It's still one of the most popular lenses that we sell.
I can't believe it's been 8 years. That means it's been out as long as I've been here. I can't fathom that. That's too much time that's gone by.
Yeah. I think it's 7. Now that I think about it, I think it's been 7 years. I think they announced it in 2012, and then the first ones came out like later that year. So it's not quite 8 years, but yeah, I mean, pretty much. I mean, you might think that.
And I just think it's great what they're doing, and they're still developing more, right? I mean, they're continually putting a lot of money into, not just future-proofing it, making high, lenses that will work well with high resolution sensors, but are they continually broadening their offering? I mean, I know they're working with a lot of the Sony and Panasonic mounts. Any word to the wise with that?
So they don't let us know what's coming down. They don't really give us much of a roadmap. What we hear sometimes the announcements the same day the rest of the world does. But they have committed to meeting the demand of the market, which right now is mirrorless. So they did shift towards making new lenses. First, to meet the demand, they were taking lenses designed for DSLRs and adapting them, to a native mount. But knowing, as you know, the autofocus systems are different between, mirror boxes and prisms versus
sensor.
Sensor. Sensor autofocus. So, the lenses were super sharp, but the autofocus just wasn't there because it was still, they were still working with autofocus motors from DSLR designed lenses. So now with the new lenses that are made specifically for the full frame mirrorless cameras, with the fly-by-wire autofocus system, it's much faster, much quieter autofocus. So yeah, those lenses have been getting, been received really well in the marketplace, and the E-mounts, again, because Sony's just, they right now are selling more cameras than anybody else. The demand for those lenses are just outrageous.
Yeah, and it's hard to get some of those too. I know we're Like the 24 to 70, it's kind of taken a while to get that in the DN series, the new one. But I love how they're able to shrink those down, even in comparison to the, the ones that would be their equivalents in the SLR mounts. I mean, we're able to shave off. It looks like you guys did like 25%. Losing weight, skinny them up, but without sacrificing any quality and everything. And I think that's really great. And I wasn't holding your feet to the fire, just so you know, like not trying to sneak any information out on like what's on the roadmap. More or less, just trying to let people know that they have the markets, they have their consumers' best interests at heart with expanding out the lineup. That they're still working on things, that they're putting, that they're working on more lenses than just what you see. So.
And they're still making lenses for DSLRs too, because there's a huge segment of the market still using DSLRs.
Oh yeah.
We prefer to use DSLRs, but as you can you see the trend going towards mirrorless, and they're definitely invested in the mirrorless market because of the Sigma's FP camera that came out last year. It's the world's smallest lightweight compact full frame camera on the market now, and it's an L mount, which as you know is the same as the Panasonic full frame and Leica. So now they're making lenses not only to meet the needs of Sony mirrorless, but also for multiple manufacturers that share the same mount. So that's been very popular as well.
Brad had an interesting question here, because I know a lot of lens choices as far as like manufacturing is concerned is what you can afford to produce and what's going to be popular to produce. He said, will they be doing a fisheye lens anytime soon? Because I know they have some older ones. So there's like an 8mm. I think there was another one, but those are part of the EX series. I mean, and again, I know, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire, but has there been any talk about a fisheye, like revisiting the fisheye, or is it more or less we just kind of have the EX series? I don't even know if the EX series is still available.
So you were right. There's the 8mm circular fisheye, so you actually get a round image that's 180 degrees from side to side, and then you have the 15mm fisheye, which is your traditional diagonal, full frame fisheye. Now, when they announced the Global Vision line, and basically they said we want to re-engineer the entire line of lenses, so eventually everything's going to be at the Global Vision level. But again, being a relatively smaller independent lens manufacturer, it's not just something they could quickly do overnight. Now, if they were a type of manufacturer that outsourced to many factories, in other parts of the country or other parts of the world, they might be able to start just pumping out lenses left and right. But that's not their business model. They want to make sure that they're keeping the quality level at what they expect. So therefore, they've kept everything in house. So they're limited to the amount of production. Now, the demand of the Global Vision lenses and how much things have changed, over since they made that announcement, is really taxing on the factory, because they have to produce what people are asking for. So like you said, the 24 to 70, they need to be able to make as many of those and fill that demand before they can, start making. Because they do everything in one factory, they're not making all of their lenses exactly the same time. They only make a handful of lenses, like less than a dozen at a time, and they make a bunch of them, over the course of so many weeks. Then they, break all the machines down, retool them, and then they pick another set, and then that's, they make a bunch of those and keep them, in a warehouse. And whoever has the job of trying to forecast what people are going to want 6 months from now or 8 months from now, or how much they need to make to last them until the next production run, I'm sure it's got to be, they got to be pulling their hair out.
Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare. It's like it's like trying to read the tea leaves, quite literally.
Yes, but I'm sorry, to answer Brad's question. So I don't know if or when it's coming, but to make an educated guess, like you said, those are still EX lenses. We still have the 105 millimeter 2.8 macro EX lens. There's a few EX lenses still in the lineup, and since they've committed themselves to saying they're going to re-engineer the entire line, we've already seen, the 70 millimeter EX macro that was discontinued a number of years ago. We came out with a new 70 millimeter. So I would say that at some point, there would be a Global Vision version of the EX lenses that are still there. But like you said, from a company standpoint, from a market standpoint, you definitely have to make what's in demand. And all the fisheye lenses are cool, and they do have their place in the market. It's not the most popular focal length, so probably not high on the priority list.
Yeah, and then it makes perfect sense. I mean, it's all going to boil down to demand, and I'm pretty sure that the way that mirrorless has grown just in the last 3 years, that it's kind of forced their hand in a direction where, probably trying to figure out, hey, we got to make these mirrorless lenses over these DSLR lenses, so it's kind of putting some of them on the back burner. Now you got to split your loyalties between a mirrorless setup and a DSLR setup, especially since they're kind of two different designs. Because with Nikon, with a DSLR, your 14 to 24 is very inherently different than your 14 to 24 that would be on your Sony or your FP lens or your Panasonic L lens. So yeah, thank you for answering those questions. Now, we shared a video earlier this week of you talking about the different lenses, what kind of what kind of looks you can get out of them, what the depth of field looks like. I was wondering if you could kind of recap that with us live a little bit. You had some examples for us. You have like a little kind of PowerPoint presentation, something that we don't have to dive into long, but just kind of wanted to follow up on kind of how different lenses give you different looks based upon what you're shooting. Because again, you're a portrait shooter by trade, right?
Well, by default.
By default, yes.
So when I shot professionally, for money, it was mainly products in architecture, hospitality, photography. My major, so I got a Bachelor of Arts for photography, and my major was advertising photography.
Okay.
But over time, it's because I used to do corporate headshots, but I was not into doing portraits. But over time, it's just something I kind of fell into, and then I really, really enjoyed it. Working for a lens manufacturer, that's one of the biggest, the most popular genres of photography. And so, as I'm teaching more and more classes, portrait classes are always very, very popular. And one of the things that I noticed that and not just with portraiture, but kind of across the board of photography, is a lot of people don't understand, the different results that you get using different size sensors. And now APS-C size sensors, now, full frame sensors are full frame sensor cameras are the price has gone down quite a bit from when back in the day. Mm-hmm. But the resolution that you got on APS-C size cameras now, they're amazing. If you have a really good lens and an APS-C size camera, you can shoot professional level photographs easily, and on a for a very, very low cost. But yeah, let me let's see here.
Yeah, we'll pull this up. And if you guys are tuning in and you have any questions for Jared or I, please feel free to throw them out there. I have a little ticker down there kind of demonstrating that. And Brad has already thrown his hat in the ring for questions. But it looks like we've got this up, and we've got it full screen now.
Okay, you there? You see it?
Yep.
Okay, so lenses are round. And so the image that comes out of the back of a lens is round. It's only square because the sensors that we're using are, I'm sorry, not square, they're rectangle. And that's why you have a rectangular image, is because it's just recording rectangular screen. So let's say that the lens that we're shooting this with is 300 millimeters. And on a full frame camera, that is about the size of the section that's going to be recorded out of the circle of illumination. And in comparison, this is the size of APS-C, and you can see how much smaller it is. And what I find is a lot of times people will say, oh, I have a 100 millimeter lens, but I'm shooting on a crop sensor. So basically I have a 150 or 160 millimeter lens. And a lot of people think that it magnifies the image. And it's not. What it's doing is it's just recording a smaller area of the same lens. So it appears as though it's been magnified, but it really isn't anything different than if you were to, take this image, the rectangular
full frame,
put it into post-production software like Photoshop and then just crop it down to that size. So it's really recording less megapixels, but using the same. So your angle of view may appear to be what would be like a 450 millimeter lens here, but you're still really just shooting with a 300 millimeter. So if you're shooting, wildlife or portraits, not a big deal. But when you're shooting something like landscape, that's where the angle of view really, really kind of matters. So manufacturers have made lenses specifically for APS-C size sensors. Every manufacturer does. Canon's is EF-S, Nikon's are DX, Sigma's, they call them DC. And it's a smaller area of illumination because it doesn't need to cover as big of a sensor. Now, the dangerous thing, and the reason why I say this is because if you are looking at purchasing a lens that's made specific for APS-C cameras, but you may think that down the road you're going to get a full frame camera, you're not going to have the coverage. The coverage is not going to be there. You would appear to, your image would have an appearance like this. You would actually see the inside of the barrel because the circle illumination is not covering the entire sensor. So when you look at, basically what I'm going to do here is kind of go through a progression of slides, going from very wide to telephoto, and in yellow is the focal length that you can see for APS-C, and one for 50. In red would be for full frame. We talked about circular fisheye before. 8 millimeter circular fisheye that we were talking about. Does not, you don't get the same effect on an APS-C size sensor. Sigma used to make a 4.5, and Sigma actually did this with a lot of their lenses. They had one lens for APS-C and one lens for full frame, so you put each of those on the corresponding sensors and you get the same effect. So it makes a difference when you get up to, like, let's say, the 30 millimeter or 50 millimeter, where they consider this kind of the normal focal length, kind of the perspective of what your eye would see. And
Yes.
The perspective is really, I think, where we want to talk more about. I'm just going to kind of zip through these for the sake of time.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So effective perspective has is if you look at these three vases in this on this fence, they're all three exactly the same size, but the one closest to the camera appears to be a lot bigger, and you see a lot more of the background. Whereas backing up and shooting with a longer focal length or getting even farther back, they appear to be about the same size. So the wider the lens, whatever's closest to the lens is going to appear to be larger.
Appear larger.
Yeah. Really quick, looking at an image shot, really wide angle. I'm about 2 feet away from their face, and you see it's very distracting in the background. You see a lot of it, and because the woman's knee and thigh are closer to the lens than anything else, it appears to be larger than it would in real life. But backing up, shooting more with a more normal to telephoto size, you see a lot less of the background, and backing up even farther, you don't really see the background at all. It's just focusing on them. And I think that this is the image that you were promoting this talk with.
Yes. Yep. And this is the most compelling, because a lot of people think that they think if they get a 35, like, yeah, I can do everything. I can get the wide angle and I can still do standard portraits, but it might not behoove them to do that because of what you're demonstrating here.
Yes. So that's so 35 is a good portrait lens if you're doing groups, or if you're doing something where it's a little more environmental, where you want to show more of the background. But if you want to do headshots, using something at 50 millimeters or wider is not going to be very flattering to your subject. If you see here, I was about 18 inches away from this model, shooting with a 24 millimeter, and you can see that each of these, the top of her head and her elbows, are about the same place in the frame. But you can see that her features are completely different in all three. The wide and more normal, the features that are closer to the camera appear to be larger. Also, her head shape looks different. If you look at the one on the left, it's a lot more oval. Her forehead appears to be much wider. The shape of her jaw and her nose appears to be a lot larger than it is in real life. And as you use the longer focal length you use, the more compression that you're going to get. It's not exaggerating the distances between the front of the nose to the cheek or the back of her head to the background. So not only do you see a lot less of the background, but you also see more compressed features. And I just want to show you, I'm going to get through these real quick. This is, oh, here we go. This is the slide I wanted to show. So this is kind of gives you an idea of perspective using a full frame versus a crop sensor. So 24 millimeter. This was a portrait class I did at a school in Nevada. This is one of the students there who was gracious enough to step in and doing a headshot with a 24 millimeter. That's what it looks like now. 50 millimeter, 105. So we saw that before. But what I want to show is using a 24 millimeter on full frame versus using 24 millimeter on the crop sensor. So what's changed is the angle of view. You don't see as much of the background, or you don't get as much into the screen, but the perspective hasn't changed at all. So when people say they want a 24 millimeter, but they're going to be using it on APS-C because it's going to be a little more like a 35 millimeter, it's going to give you the angle of view of a 35, but it's not going to give you the perspective. And same thing when people shoot with a 35, thinking, oh, well, it's on APS-C, so it'll be like a 50 or a 55. Not necessarily. You're going to be getting the perspective of.
So the barrel distortion doesn't change. It's if I'm perceiving that right, because I'm trying to. I went to school for all this, and I should know all this. Shame on me. But it's one of those things where I never really thought about that either. That okay, you're not really zoomed in. You're doing nothing different than what you would do cropping, but it does change. So if I shoot with a 24 on an APS-C, I'm getting the barrel distortion of the 24, correct?
So barrel distortion would be more, like the straight lines that you see, in an image, and that's typically a characteristic of the lens. And you start to see it more on wider lenses, like a fisheye.
Okay.
I mean, that's a perfect example. They call it spherical distortion too. So that's one thing you can correct for that kind of distortion. But what we're seeing here with the wider angle lenses is basically whatever is closest to the lens.
Yes.
I'm using the camera here.
Yeah.
Closer something gets, there's no way that my 4 fingers are as big as my head in real life, but because it's closer, the perspective makes it appear to be closer. So the same thing with wider lens you get, even though the front of your nose, the back of the nose may only be inch and a half, 2 inches, depending on your facial structure. Just that much difference, closer to the lens makes it that much bigger.
So it's angular distortion and perspective distortion, correct?
Correct.
And so the one I'm just trying to wrap my head around, because you were saying, like, you were showing that last slide, and the framing was still the same. So that would be the perspective is still the same, but the angular on an APS-C, which one changes? Because one changes and one doesn't, right? If I'm using
so the focal length, how much you see is what's going to change. So if looking at the screen, looking at me, if it was full frame, basically the lens is still going to give you the same perspective. You're just not going to see as much. So it'd be just the same as if you were to take a screenshot of me now and then go into, I can't do this in there, it's really difficult. You go into Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever, use crop tool, and you crop in just a little bit. Nothing changed as far as, you eliminated some of the background on the sides, on the edges, but the way that things are represented, reproduced in the middle, are going to, sorry, should have put off that notification.
That's okay.
You there? You got me?
Yeah, hang on. I'll remove you. I'll bring you back. See if that changes it.
Okay.
Oh, now I got you frozen. Well, this is fun.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can still hear you. You can still hear me, right?
Yeah.
Yep. So I mean, if we have a blank screen because it's frozen, I think that's okay.
Everybody knows what I look like now, so I can start sharing screens. going
Yeah,
forward.
yeah, yeah. See if you can share a screen real quick, just to see if we can still get that. Otherwise, you could get all the way out and get back in. Yeah, we can still share the screen, so
Okay.
you can still see that. Now, there was a quick question here from John. John is saying, is there a better, in parentheses, better focal length for parentheses small 10-inch square product photography? Um, I guess the question asked John would be, what kind of product photography he's taking, right?
Yes. So, if we're talking about shooting product photography in a 10 by 10 space, it's kind of the same rule as far as the distortion that you're going to see. So let's take let's take food photography for example. And I'm sorry, for some reason my screen is here we go. And I'm not even in the right. Yeah, we're just going to go to, let's leave on this image and I'll talk and I'll switch it to something.
No worries, man, we're good.
Photography, for instance. You have, let's say that you have a 10-inch plate with food on it, and you have a napkin and fork and knife and glass on there. If you could fill the frame with that with a 35 millimeter lens or a 100 millimeter lens. But the 35, you're going to be a lot closer to the plate, and the glass in the corner of the frame is going to be a little bit, kind of angled. You're going to see a lot more of the edge of the table around the plate. And the plate's not going to be perfectly round circle. It's going to be more of like an oval or kind of oblong. And whatever is on the plate that's closest to the camera is going to appear a lot larger. So if you were shooting like hamburger and fries, and the fries are closer to the camera, or the lens, I should say, the fries are going to look huge, like this huge amount of fries and a little tiny burger in the back. Whereas if you were to take the same shot, back up, fill the frame, and use a 100 millimeter lens, everything is going to look more like it would in real life.
Okay, and he was saying he was working in a 10-inch space is what he was working in. Small 10-inch square is what it sounds like.
So yeah, and I used to do product photography, and I will tell you that using longer focal length lenses definitely helps for multiple reasons. One, you definitely get a lot more lifelike reproduction, because distances between one part of the product and another part of the product are going to look a lot more true than with wider lenses or normal lenses. But the other thing is your working distance. So if you're lighting this, or even if you're using available light, the closer that you're working towards your products, you can start to crowd out the light, or the camera might start casting shadows, or you might be in a reflection, whereas the farther back you can be in product photography, you have a more advantage.
And and again, these are just some follow-up things with what you're explaining. He's saying, most realistic to the product, what lens most accurately shows if I'm selling just the set of silverware. And he says, thank you, lifelike is good. So I guess maybe you had answered it. It sounds like using a telephoto, backing up and kind of isolating that space will give us the lifelike size of a product.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And you would recommend like anything greater than a 105? I know that Sigma makes a great 105 macro. Is there any other lens that you would recommend being in that kind of environment?
So yeah, shooting products, it's great to have a lens that has a very close focusing ability. So whether it's a not macro lens that has has the ability to focus very, very closely, or a macro lens which you can focus extremely close, because sometimes I was doing projects where I was shooting things that were 12 inches larger, and then all of a sudden I get a job shooting little microprocessors and things that were an inch or smaller. And if you have a lens like a 105 macro, it's great because you can back up and shoot at a 3-foot distance if you want to shoot a larger product, and you're going to get lifelike reproduction. Again, you're also, especially if you're backing up and shooting something large, you're going to see a lot less of your background if you have a longer focal length. But you also at the same time have the capability to shoot up close for when you're like for instance, you're shooting a set of silverware, but maybe there's a particular design on the, on the silverware, or there's an emblem or a logo or something that your client wants to highlight, being able to have the ability to shoot macro as well as, full length really helps.
Great. So I think that answers your question, John. But if there's anything we missed, don't be shy. Let us know. But I think that's a great answer. Sometimes I don't think about that when we're doing stuff for eBay, here in the store. But you've got some other images here outside of that little PowerPoint presentation where you're kind of talking about the area of space and angular distortion, perspective distortion. What do we have here, Jared?
Yeah. So when people think of portraits and they talk about portrait lenses, everybody automatically assumes, 85 millimeter, 105, 135, or using a lens like a 70 to 200. But it's not to say that you can't. You can shoot a portrait with pretty much any lens. You can shoot a portrait with a fisheye, but it really depends on the effect and the result that you want to have. So in this image here, this was shot with the Sigma 24 to 35 f2. If I remember correctly, I was on the longer end of it. I think it was I was around 30 or 32. But that is a lens of choice. Now, had I, and the reason why is because I wanted to show more of the environment. And these type of portraits are called environmental portraits, meaning it's not just, let me back up. A typical, when people think of portraits, it's basically giving a representation of what this person looks like. And it's great if you can kind of pull their character out, their personality out a little bit of the portrait. But when you shoot an environmental portrait, you're including a person in an environment because it's not only a picture of what the person looks like, but you're telling a story about the person. So, for instance, had I just shot a picture of this woman, if I would have backed up and shot with a longer focal length, like a 100, 150, or 200, you would just see, her face, and you'd see, the type of wardrobe that she's wearing, and may not really understand why it is that she's wearing that, or what it is. Whether she a stewardess, or is she a pilot, or is that a nurse outfit? I don't know what's going on. Whereas I backed up, I got closer, I shot a wider angle lens, and I showed the plane in the background. Now this was shot wide open at f2, and talking about depth of field, normally with longer focal lengths, shooting a really wide aperture, your background absolutely disappears because it's so out of focus, you can't see what's going on. Wider angle lenses, the background will go out of focus, but not out of focus so much that you can't see what's going on.
It becomes less extreme. That depth of field becomes less extreme when you're at a wider open aperture as you get wider with the lens. Correct. Yeah. So had I shot this lens with like a 50, or shot this portrait with like a 50 millimeter lens, you would see a lot less of the plane, and maybe not, unless you knew exactly what it was behind her, you wouldn't understand that it's a plane, and you wouldn't understand the context of her and where she is or what she's doing. Now I did back up just enough. Now you can see. I mean, if you met this woman in real life, her features are very similar to what you see here. There is a little bit of facial change, but the fact that I'm back enough to where you don't really see that extreme perspective distortion that you would with the examples that we were showing earlier. And another thing about this image that I just want to touch on since we're talking about it, typically when I shoot portraits, you want to be about eye level or maybe just slightly above them. Rarely do you want to shoot up at somebody unless it's on purpose. And the purpose being you want to give the feeling of authority or confidence or power. And because of the type of setting that we were in, and with her contemplative look, definitely wanted to give her, convey the feeling of, power and authority and confidence. And I think it's a great shot. Nice. I'm a big fan of World War II, so it's always nice seeing those older planes.
And as far as we all, let me see if I have one here. want to show a depth of field. I just have to remember. Oh, I know it is. For American children. Talking about depth of field on the other end, shooting. Here we go. So this was shot with an 85 millimeter 1.4 art, and I will tell you, I have, and you probably get this a lot in the camera shop. People will come in and they're like, "Hey, I bought this 85 millimeter 1.4 art. Everyone says it's super sharp, but for some reason, sometimes my images just aren't that sharp. I can't see why." And then I look at their examples. It's because they're shooting something up close, as wide open as they can. Mm-hmm. And like we were talking about before, the longer the focal length, the shorter your depth of field is naturally. So when you're shooting, and this is about as close as you get with the 85, maybe a little closer, but shooting wide open, if you look at my son here, so his eyes are in focus, mm-hmm. but it's going out of focus on his nose, and it's going out of focus right up here, just at the back of his brow.
Yeah, near the temple, yeah.
Yeah, so now typically, if you're shooting portraits, and that's a personal preference, but typically when you're shooting portraits, you want to have their entire head in focus. I happen to do this for dramatic effect. I just wanted to focus on his eyes and his freckles. You see his ears went out of focus, his hair goes out of focus, his shirt goes out of focus. That is definitely a personal preference. But with the depth of field we're talking about here, that's less than an inch, which is a dangerously thin area of depth of field, considering, as a photographer, you're holding the camera, you're moving just a little bit. You're dealing with a living person, they're moving just a little bit. Just a movement of half an inch is going to make or break that sharp focus.
Yes.
So sometimes when I'm doing headshots at 85 and I want to get close, I'll stop down to 2.2, 2.5, 2.8, just to make sure I have enough wiggle room to, that if somebody moves, that both eyes are in focus, and try to get most of their head in focus.
And I was just gonna ask you that question too, as kind of a follow up to what you just said there. I did a lot of portrait photography, was my emphasis coming out of college, and I had kind of tried everything. From sports photography, to the studio photography, even though I did my internship and I later did my assisting at a food studio, portraits were my thing. I find people interesting. And, I did, my portfolio was a lot of environmental portraits, kind of like your first shot, you're using the background to describe who your subject is. And, I had never thought about, the tendency is when you can shoot at 1.4, you shoot at 1.4. It's like, yeah, I'm going to shoot wide open. But you're saying kind of the opposite is like, it's a dangerous precedent to shoot wide open at 1.4. Just because you have a thing doesn't mean you have to use a thing.
Right. Now, if, let me show you a different image shot with the same lens. Oh, that was my son taking our portrait. Here's also shooting at 1.4. So much farther away, you can see how much depth of field you have. So where's my cursor? Yeah, so down here, focus is right at the front and drops off about 3 or 4 feet behind them. So how far away you are from your subject also determines the depth of field. And this is why it's great, and it's funny, so if you see here, the background is just completely blurred. You're not looking at anything but his eyes. Whereas an image like this, even though the background is out of focus, you still see enough that you can kind of tell that they're the environment that they're in.
And was this with a 50 or an 85?
No, this was with the 85. It was the same exact lens, same shoot as this.
Okay.
Yeah, just this was probably 12 or 15 inches away. This one, and I think I cropped this one also a little bit too. I think there was more in the original one. There was a little bit more space around them.
Yeah, it's interesting how depth of field changes. I shoot night sky photography, and you can get away opening all the way up at 1.4 to let in a lot of that light. And depending on where your focus is at, you can get a lot of the sky can still be relatively in focus if you've got something in the foreground or whatever you're focusing on is still kind of far away from the camera too. But anything in the foreground, like if I had dune grass or something in the foreground, that would all be thrown out of focus.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
And then I guess, I mean, anything else? Talking about, lenses that have, so this was shot with what was an APS-C camera with a 30 millimeter lens. So effectively, you're looking at around 50-ish,
Mm-hmm.
in that range, which would be considered, a normal lens. But talking about having a non-distracting background, if you have a background where it's not distracting, it's just blank like this. Don't forget the rule of thirds. Is one of the rule of thirds I use in portrait photography constantly, and it's not. I don't use it all the time. I break the rules, but yes, moving your subject to the left or to the right, just a little bit, just off center, and leaving that negative space on one side of the image or the other, can be really impactful.
And 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 his is like the intersecting point, like on his right eyeball. Is that where kind of
Uh,
that
yeah,
is?
yeah.
Yeah,
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 so
and
if you were
that's
to divide but I know you know this, but if nobody knows what we're talking about, if you were to take your image and divide it into thirds, so we have one third on the top and take another line and slice down here, so you have, a third of the top, third in the middle, a third in the bottom, and then the same way doing it vertically, where if you were to slice it, into thirds, so you'd have a line there and a line here, so you'd have, a third on the left, third in the middle, third on the right. You look at those slice lines, trying to line your subject up either on the line or where the lines intersect. So if you have eyes and you can move them to at or near the intersecting lines, it definitely makes a much more compelling image than if he was just right smack in the middle.
and because this is a very minimalistic kind of studio shot, are you using strobes here or is this window light?
No, this is window light. This was in a
Yeah.
restaurant, midday, right between lunch and dinner, and just moved him up against. We moved tables out of the way. Just moved him right up against the wall, and right there's a huge window just to camera left.
Uh,
Super simple.
and John is asking again. He says, "Did the wall give his skin tone a red hue?"
Yes, it did, and that's actually something that when I talk about window light, I always talk about you have to look at, I should say not just window light, but available light. You have to look at all the light in the room. I will say though, he was also out in the sun quite a bit that day, so he did. I know that his neck did have quite a bit of sun on him. And I can say, but looking at his shirt, this is not perfectly white balanced right now. But yeah, you can see a lot on the camera right side of his face, the reflection of the orange onto his skin.
Yeah, I don't think it's not too distracting for me. I mean, I felt it was just kind of the way that the shadow and maybe the light was reflecting off the wall just a little bit. That's how his face looked like in shadow. So I actually think it's a really nice clean shot. That's why it's always kind of fun trying to guess. I can't zoom in like you can with the eyeballs to see what the catch light's looking like, but it's just like that nice, really clean bluish light. So
And like you said, it was a shot with strobe. I do that all the time. I look at an image, I try to figure out how it was lit. And when I went to school and started working with commercial photographers, I just thought it was cool just to have a cool set, with a lot of lights up and look super professional and totally like Hollywood. And the more I learned about light, when you're creating, studio lights are great because you can create and modify and make it look exactly the way you want. But what you're trying to do is make it look as natural as possible. Or at least not make it look like it's screaming, this was shot with strobes. So I started shooting a lot more with window light and available light because your natural light's beautiful. And, I use studio lights when I need to, but I try to the least amount possible. I had an instructor in school. He saw me start lighting something in the studio once and just start setting up lights left and right. And he's like, no. What you do is you start with one light, start with your main key light that you want to use,
and you
then you start adding from there.
Yes. And that's kind of where, because I know we're at an hour of time, and I don't want to take up too much of your evening because we only said that we would take an hour from you here, Jared. But I guess, like a passing thing, John is asking, hey, he's just trying to understand how things work. And I think this is a really good nugget of information that we just kind of shared here amongst ourselves is that I love to look at the eyes to see what the catchlight is, because the devil's in the details, and a photo will tell you everything that you need to know if you look at it. And I actually like critiquing people's work. We do this Facebook photo challenge, and I try to tell people, hey, are you in this country? I'm trying to look at all the details. Like, are you in this country because I see these kinds of trees or these kinds of buildings? And the same thing with portraits can be the same, is like, look at the eyes, because that'll tell you what the studio looks like, or what they're using to light it. But you also brought up another important point of just trying to understand things. He brought up a good point with the color cast from the wall, potentially. The other thing is, you're talking about adding lights. Those are all really good points. So I guess our kind of not passing moment, but our kind of one of the last questions could be, or what are some good tips that you would give to kind of photographers and things to look for when creating their work or just producing their work?
Looking for how light works. Looking at how different types of light land on different types of subjects. Because our eyes, when your eyes see somebody in a room that has like overhead fluorescent, lighting, we see that person a lot differently than the camera is going to record that person. You record it and it might have a color shift, and the shadows are going to be under the brows, which typically when you're talking to someone, you're not looking at those kind of details. But when you get the image back, you're like, oh wow, it's just not exactly what I thought what it was going to look like. So what I recommend is for people to just kind of look at images that you like, try to figure out to the best of your knowledge how it was lit, where the shadows are coming from. Like you said, look at the eyes or the reflective surfaces and see where the light source is coming from. And you can reproduce it, either with available light or with strobes. Looking at how light shines in from a window different times of the day. In my house, depending on the type of look I get or I want, I will shoot it at a different window. And in seeing light, it's not just about the quality of the light, meaning if it's really bright, if it's soft, if it's even, if it's harsh, but also the color. So like this, we're talking about, you're talking about the catch lights. This image shot with window light. There's me right smack in the middle of her pupil. And even light. This was a huge one, sliding glass door, a whole wall of windows. And I shot this young lady, and directly behind her, you can kind of see up here and down here the color cast from the interior lights. And this was not a situation where I had any control over those lights. But if I did, and this was kind of the look I was going for, and I had strobe lights, I would have turned the interior lights off, brought strobe lights or constant lights or something in here to light her from behind, to be able to see her hair and to be able to get the detail back here, but have it the same color or same tone as the light that's falling on her face. But this is also something that could have been done in the studio. If you have a big enough light source behind you, you can create this kind of flat lighting that you see here.
Yeah, big, huge soft boxes and really close to your subject, right? If they're big.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, really cool. So any passing thoughts outside of that? Any tips, Jared, before we kind of let you get back to what you do best?
Oh man, you know what? That is really difficult to say, because I could go on and on and on and on. So this class here, the images that I have here, these were taken from a class I did on window light, and like I said, looking at where different, how different light, affects everything. This shot, this window, this table, this subject is the exact same place as this shot.
And it's this time of day, right?
It's time of day, and also the fact that these blinds are closed, they're open here, but also the exposure. Had I used, this is actually shooting a little bit brighter than what the camera's meter was saying was correct, or if I was shooting in an automatic mode, like aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode, this would not have had this kind of high key look to it. Same thing here. I underexposed for what the camera was thinking was going to be correct, because I wanted the mood. When I shoot I always shoot in RAW. I always shoot in manual. And I always shoot in daylight balance, which for Canon is 5200 Kelvin. And in post, in Bridge or Photoshop, I will then adjust the color temperature if I need. But if I am shooting in automatic mode, it's not going to have this cool blue cast. This is actually what the morning light looked like coming through, right then. And that's what it looked like when I walked into the room. And I see that a lot where people take photographs, on auto white balance, on auto exposure, and it doesn't come out the way that they're seeing it in their mind. And that's where I recommend people really learning about about their controlling their exposure on aperture. Really, start off with your aperture to know how much depth of field you want, and then use your shutter speed or your ISO accordingly to get the correct aperture. Because a lot of times, if anyone's tried to shoot a beautiful sunset, it's really hard to get those colors to look exactly the way they do in real life in your camera or on your phone, because it's trying to shoot an auto exposure. As smart as they are, they don't know everything, and they don't know what you're looking for. So if it's something where I feel that something is too warm or too cool, I will adjust the color in post. But most of the time, I like just kind of seeing what comes out when I shoot it in neutral daylight balance.
Yeah, and did you mess around with the white balance here in post? I mean, was it like 6,000 degrees Kelvin, or that's just?
No, this is the way it came out of the camera.
Okay, nice. So and you said you were in daylight balance is what you were shooting at, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. Very nice.
And I guess one last thing. I guess there could be a lot of last things, but if you end up having an image where you're fighting different color because of window light and light that's coming in from other parts of the room, or reflections like this.
A mixed color temperature environment.
Yeah, mixed color temperature. Go to monochrome. That will solve that problem in a heartbeat.
Yeah, because then it becomes about your contrast. It becomes more about your tonality, your what they call the what scale is that from 0 to 10? The zone system, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
Well, Jared, I guess again we've gone 117. Don't leave the room right away when I end this. Stick around if you could.
Okay.
And then John was saying, hey, let's do this again. John, we're gonna try to do a lot of different things with a lot of our Jared was kind enough to do this for us this evening. We've had I can't think of his name. We had someone else on. I can't.
Mark Farb?
Mark Farb, yes, thank you so much. You're saving me. You're my lifesaver here, Jared, this evening. Mark Farb was on. We did an interview with him about 2 or 3 weeks ago. So we're going to be doing this continuously. So continue to join us. We'd love having people who are passionate about photography like yourself, Jared, and you've got a lot of knowledge there, and just very glad that you could share that with us this evening.
So Sigma has 7 tech reps total, and we are all, we all have different skills and talents, and on a number of different subjects. Like Mark Farb is great with action and wildlife photos, which that's not my strength at all. I can tell you technical features on lenses for that type of photography, but actually, being able to speak to that kind of photography is not my wheelhouse. But we have, like I said, we have 7 different tech reps, all with different talents. So definitely utilize those guys. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, and we're going to definitely take advantage of that, and that's what we did here this evening with Jared. So Jared, thanks again. Like I said, stick around. Don't go anywhere, because I'll talk with you after we close the broadcast. But again, everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks again, Jared. I hope we get to see you again sometime.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Justin. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for watching.
Take care.
You too. Bye.